All right, we've got some breaking news from the United Kingdom and the royal family.
Catherine reveals the truth about Louis. Prince George is left speechless. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because that title points to something far more serious than an ordinary royal conversation. The reported revelation centers on Catherine discovering that plans concerning Louis's future had allegedly been discussed without George being told. When Catherine brought the matter before her eldest son, George was reportedly left unable to answer. This was not simply about titles or succession. It was about a decision that could shape how two brothers would stand beside each other. And the question hanging over that room was brutally simple. Who had decided Louis's future before George knew there was a decision to make? Now watch this closely. George was not being shown a ceremonial document or prepared for another lesson about becoming king. The reported scene was far more personal. Catherine had information she believed her son needed to hear, and the subject was Louis. She had allegedly come across private briefings, correspondence, and planning discussions that raised questions about where Louis might eventually fit within the monarchy. The language reportedly suggested independence and a future built on different responsibilities from George's. None of that automatically meant Louis was being pushed away. That was precisely what made the situation difficult. A plan could be presented as protection while still feeling like exclusion to the person never consulted. George's silence mattered because he understood that his future would differ from his siblings' futures. He was the heir, the child expected one day to carry the crown. But knowing that is different from discovering that a private decision about Louis may already have been taking shape behind closed doors. According to the story, Catherine was not telling George that Louis had done something wrong. She was telling him that adults around the family had been discussing what Louis's life might become. For George, the shock was not simply Louis having another path. It was realizing that people had been planning around his brother while he remained outside the conversation. Hi viewers, if you were George and discovered that your brother's future had been discussed behind your back, would you want your mother to tell you immediately? Leave a comment and give one honest answer. If family were involved, silence might feel like protection to one person and betrayal to another. That is why Catherine's reported decision to speak matters. She was forcing George to confront a possibility he had never seriously considered, that Louis's future could be altered by decisions made before Louis understood them. And if that truth had remained hidden, George might have continued preparing for his own destiny without realizing how deeply it could affect his younger brother. Catherine reportedly understood that George needed more than a vague explanation. The answer was buried inside the planning itself. The proposals concerning Louis were not presented as punishment. They were connected to a concern inside royal families, how a younger child can build an identity when an older sibling is destined to become monarch. George could inherit the crown. Louis could never inherit that same position. But the emotional consequences are not fixed. A younger brother can feel overlooked. An heir can feel responsible. Affection can become obligation without either person intending it. And that was where the atmosphere around George reportedly changed. He was no longer listening as a future king. He was listening as a brother. If Louis pursued his own interests, education, friendships, and eventual career outside the central working monarchy, would that mean freedom? Or would it create distance between the brothers? George could understand the practical argument. What he could not accept was the idea that such a future might have been discussed without him. The people around him may have believed they were protecting both boys, but George could only see what had been hidden. Catherine reportedly faced a difficult choice. She could allow the matter to remain inside a small circle of adults, where decisions could be refined before the children heard about them. Or she could tell George what had been uncovered. Once George knew, the secret could no longer be treated as a quiet administrative matter. It became a family issue. Every word would matter, and the most uncomfortable question was waiting. If this plan was meant to protect Louis, why had George been kept outside it for so long? The reported answer was that George was considered too young, too emotionally involved, or simply not ready to carry the weight of decisions around his brother. But Catherine apparently saw another danger. Keeping George uninformed could create the very misunderstanding the plan was supposed to prevent. If he discovered the truth later, he might believe Lewis had been taken away from him, rather than given room to build a life of his own. That distinction became the heart of the confrontation. Catherine was trying to stop George from interpreting Lewis's independence as rejection. Yet the deepest part of the story had not reached the room. George still did not know how long the discussions had been taking place. He did not know what first triggered concern about Lewis's future. Most importantly, he did not know who had authorized the direction Catherine had discovered. That missing name could turn a painful family conversation into a palace crisis. George reportedly looked toward his mother, expecting reassurance. Instead, Catherine confronted the question she had been avoiding. Someone had made the original decision. Someone had believed it was necessary, and someone had allowed the plan to move forward without George knowing. The room fell into silence. Catherine had revealed the truth about Louis, but not the entire truth. The next part was worse. It was about who had the authority to decide it. If you think George deserved to know before anyone made plans for his brother, stay with this story. Subscribe, share it, and do not look away, because the next part reveals who allowed the secret to go that far. The question was no longer whether Louis had a different future. George already understood that part. The question was why someone had been preparing that future quietly, and why Catherine had only now discovered how far those preparations had gone. Catherine did not rush to answer. She knew that one wrong sentence could make George believe the worst. The information she had uncovered was complicated, and the people involved had apparently used careful language to make the plan sound ordinary. There were references to education, future responsibilities, private interests, and a gradual reduction in expectations surrounding Louis. On paper, nothing looked explosive. Taken together, however, the pieces created a very different picture. According to the reported account, Catherine first became suspicious after noticing that discussions about Louis were becoming unusually specific. His future was being described with a certainty that seemed strange for someone still years away from adulthood. There appeared to be ideas about what kind of work he might eventually pursue, how much public responsibility he might carry, and how far his life could remain separate from the central duties of the monarchy. That was the moment Catherine reportedly began asking questions. She wanted to know whether these were simply possibilities being considered, or whether somebody had already started turning them into a plan. The distinction mattered. Families discuss children's futures all the time. Royal families, however, operate under a level of scrutiny and institutional planning that can make private decisions much more complicated. A suggestion can become a briefing can become a recommendation can eventually become an expectation. Catherine reportedly wanted to know where Louis stood in that chain. The first answers did not satisfy her. She was told that nothing had been finalized. The language was reassuring. There was no immediate announcement, no formal change to Lewis's position, no public decision that could be pointed to as proof of anything dramatic. But Catherine continued looking. What she reportedly found was not one secret document announcing Lewis's future. It was something more subtle. A series of discussions appeared to point in the same direction. Louis would be encouraged to develop interests outside the narrow structure of royal duty. He could eventually pursue a career or public role that did not depend entirely on George. His identity would be allowed to develop separately from the future king. The idea itself was not necessarily alarming. In fact, Catherine could understand the reasoning. George was destined for an extraordinary burden. His future would eventually involve constitutional responsibility, public expectation, and the pressure of becoming monarch. Louis would not carry the same weight. Giving him space to build his own identity could be healthy. But then Catherine reportedly noticed something that changed the way she viewed the entire arrangement. The discussions appeared to have started before the family had openly discussed the matter with George. That detail mattered more than any individual proposal. George was already old enough to understand that his position affected his siblings. He was learning what succession meant. He was beginning to understand why his schedule, responsibilities, and public appearances could look different from those of Charlotte and Louis. Yet while George was learning about his own future, adults were apparently discussing Louis's future separately. Catherine reportedly became concerned that the family was creating two separate tracks, without explaining how those tracks would remain connected. One track led toward the crown. The other led away from it, and if those paths were designed too early, there was a danger that Louis could eventually feel as though his independence had been decided for him. That was not the future Catherine wanted. She reportedly questioned senior aides about the language being used in the planning. Why was Louis being described as someone who needed a separate identity before he had even chosen one? Why were there already discussions about reducing expectations around him? Why did some of the language sound less like an open possibility and more like a predetermined direction? The answers became increasingly careful. That made Catherine even more suspicious. A person who has nothing to hide usually has less reason to avoid a straightforward explanation. Catherine reportedly pressed harder. Eventually, the argument was presented in a way that sounded almost impossible to challenge. The plan was supposedly designed to protect Louis. He would not have to spend his entire life being compared with George. He would not have to measure his worth against the future king. He would have the freedom to develop his own interests. He could choose a profession. He could establish a public identity that belonged to him. He could build relationships outside the machinery surrounding the throne. All of those arguments had logic, but Catherine reportedly saw the missing piece. Nobody had asked what Louis wanted. That realization changed the entire conversation. A future created in someone's best interests can still become a future imposed upon them. Catherine reportedly made that concern clear. Louis should not be treated as a problem that needed to be solved simply because his brother was destined to become king. His position might be different, but different did not mean less important. That distinction became increasingly important as Catherine examined the material. Then she reportedly found the reference that made her stop. It suggested that the discussions had not originated with a routine review of the children's future. Someone had raised the issue because of concerns about what could happen between the brothers as they grew older. The fear was not that George and Louis were rivals. There was no reported evidence that they were. The concern was what royal pressure might eventually do to their relationship. History had shown that unequal royal positions could create complicated relationships between siblings. One child could inherit the crown, while another searched for a purpose beside it. Public attention could amplify every difference. Money, status, influence, expectation, and duty could eventually create tensions that did not exist during childhood. The people behind the reported plan appeared to believe that the safest solution was to establish independence early. Catherine understood the concern. What she questioned was the secrecy. If the goal was to protect the brothers, why was the plan being developed in a way that could make George feel excluded from his own family's decisions? That question reportedly led to a private confrontation. Catherine challenged the people involved and demanded to know whether the direction surrounding Louis had already been approved. The response was carefully worded. Nothing was final. But that was not the same as saying nothing had been decided. There was already a direction. There were already recommendations. There was already an expectation that Louis's future would eventually be shaped differently. And according to the story, Catherine finally understood that the issue was much larger than one proposal. The plan had been developing quietly for months. That was the first major revelation. George had not been kept outside a single conversation. He had potentially been kept outside an entire process. Catherine reportedly realized that telling George only part of the truth would make the situation worse. He needed to understand why the plan existed, but he also needed to know that Louis was not being punished or removed from the family. Still, one question remained unanswered. Who had given the plan its authority? Catherine had found the discussions. She had challenged the people carrying them forward. But somewhere inside the chain of correspondence was a reference to the person who had authorized the original direction. And that name was not sitting on the surface. It was buried deeper inside the paperwork. Catherine reportedly reached that point and understood that the story was about to change completely. Because the person behind the plan was not simply an aide following instructions. Someone with real influence had decided that Louis's future needed to be handled this way. And when Catherine finally discovered who had approved it, the question would no longer be whether George deserved to know. It would be whether the person who authorized it had ever intended for George to know at all. If you believe a family decision this important should never be hidden from the people it will affect, stay with this story, because the next revelation takes the secret from a private family concern straight into the heart of the palace. The room had changed the moment Catherine understood that the secret was bigger than Louis. She was no longer asking what the plan meant. She was asking who had decided that the plan should exist in the first place. George still knew only enough to feel betrayed. He had learned that conversations about Louis had been taking place for months. He had learned that his brother's future had been discussed in careful language, mapped out in possibilities, and quietly considered by people close to the family. But he still did not know the reason behind the secrecy. More importantly, he did not know who had given those discussions their authority. Catherine reportedly refused to let the matter disappear behind palace language. She wanted direct answers. The people involved insisted that nothing had been done against Louis. They argued that the proposals were intended to protect him from a future in which every achievement could be measured against George. They pointed to the enormous difference between being the future monarch and being the younger brother of the future monarch. One position came with a constitutional destiny. The other came with freedom, but also uncertainty. Their argument was simple. Louis needed his own life. Catherine could not completely disagree. What troubled her was the method. A child could be given freedom without adults quietly deciding what that freedom should look like. A son could be encouraged to develop his own interests without a private structure being created around him before he had the opportunity to understand what was happening. That distinction became the center of the confrontation. Catherine reportedly asked whether George had been consulted. The answer was no. She asked whether Louis had been consulted. Again, no. Then she asked the question that made the room uncomfortable. Who had decided that this was necessary? Silence followed. That silence told Catherine more than the carefully prepared explanations had. The people defending the plan were not denying that someone had initiated it. They were simply reluctant to identify the person who had done so. Catherine reportedly pushed again. She wanted the name. The response eventually came in a form that revealed why the matter had been handled so cautiously. The person who had authorized the direction was not merely an advisor offering an opinion. The decision had apparently carried enough senior backing to make others believe it should proceed quietly. That changed the stakes. This was no longer a question of palace staff discussing possibilities. It was a question of authority, and George was about to become part of that question. When Catherine finally explained enough of the situation to him, George reportedly struggled to understand why protecting Louis required secrecy from him. He could understand that Louis might eventually choose a different career. He could understand that Louis would not carry the same responsibilities. What he could not understand was why those differences had to be discussed, as though they were something the family needed to prepare for behind closed doors. George reportedly asked the question that exposed the emotional heart of the problem. If the plan was meant to protect Louis, why did it feel like Louis was being taken away? Catherine understood exactly what he meant. The answer was not easy. She reportedly explained that the plan was never supposed to separate the brothers emotionally. It was supposed to prevent Louis from becoming dependent on George's future position. If Louis grew up believing his purpose was simply to stand beside George, then the relationship could eventually become complicated by obligation. George rejected that idea. He believed brothers could remain close without needing a formal strategy to protect them from one another. But Catherine knew that royal life rarely remained that simple. A future king could eventually become surrounded by duties, advisors, security arrangements, constitutional expectations, and public scrutiny. His younger brother could build a very different life. Even if they loved each other deeply, the pressure surrounding them could change the way the world treated them. Every appearance could be compared. Every decision could be analyzed. Every difference could become a headline. Catherine reportedly feared that if Louis had no identity beyond his relationship with George, resentment could eventually grow where affection once existed. But George heard something else. He heard that adults were already imagining a future in which he and Louis might become distant. That possibility frightened him. He reportedly insisted that he and Louis could make their own promises. They could remain close. They could support each other. They did not need a palace plan to tell them how to be brothers. Catherine did not dismiss him. Instead, she reportedly told him that the plan was never meant to control their relationship. It was meant to give Louis enough freedom that their relationship would not be controlled by the monarchy. That distinction finally made George pause. For the first time, he began to see the problem from Louis's side. If George became king, Louis could spend his entire adulthood being introduced as the king's brother. His achievements could be measured against George's position. His mistakes could be judged through the royal connection. Even his personal choices could become matters of public speculation. Independence could protect him from that. But George still had one objection. The decision had been made without him, and that wound could not be explained away by saying the plan was well-intentioned. Catherine reportedly recognized it immediately. She had discovered the secret because she believed Louis deserved protection. Now she realized George needed protection from another kind of burden. He needed to understand that becoming heir did not mean becoming responsible for controlling his siblings' lives. That was when the argument reached its most personal point. George reportedly asked whether Louis was being prepared to leave the central royal role entirely. Catherine answered carefully. Nothing was fixed. That was important. The discussions were reportedly about possibilities, not an irreversible decision. But there was already a preferred direction. Louis would be encouraged to develop a life that belonged to him. George would be prepared for the responsibilities attached to his position. Charlotte would have her own place and choices. The family could remain united without forcing every child into the same pattern. George listened. Then came the question Catherine had been expecting. Who started all of this? She did not answer immediately, because now she knew the name. The person behind the original authorization had not acted simply because Louis was young or because George was the heir. There had been a deeper concern about what the next generation of the monarchy might look like, and that concern had apparently been taken seriously enough to move the idea from conversation into planning. George was silent again. This time, however, his silence carried anger rather than confusion. He was beginning to realize that his future as king had consequences long before he ever wore a crown. His position had already influenced decisions concerning his brother. That realization was painful. Catherine reportedly told him that none of this was his fault, but George did not appear convinced. If his future was powerful enough to shape Louis's future without his permission, then what else would eventually change because of the crown? That question left Catherine with no easy answer. She could reassure him that family would always come first, but the monarchy had already demonstrated how difficult that promise could become. And then Catherine revealed the part of the story that she had been holding back. The people behind the plan had not simply been worried about Louis. They had been worried about what might happen if Louis remained too closely attached to George's future. They feared dependency. They feared comparison. They feared resentment. And most significantly, they believed the problem needed to be addressed before the brothers were old enough to understand the pressures waiting for them. That was the second major revelation. The secret plan was not created because Louis had done something wrong. It existed because someone believed the monarchy itself could eventually create a problem between two brothers who loved each other. George finally understood the logic, but understanding it did not make the secrecy easier to accept. Then Catherine reached the final question. There was one part of the story George still had not heard: the name of the person who had authorized the original direction. Catherine reportedly knew that once she said it aloud, the entire meaning of the conversation would change. Because the authority behind the plan was closer to the family's inner decision-making than George had imagined. And once that name was revealed, George would have to decide whether the plan had been a betrayal of Louis, an attempt to protect him, or both at the same time. The answer was waiting in the confidential record Catherine had uncovered, and the next words from his mother would leave George completely speechless. Catherine finally said the words George had been waiting to hear. The authority behind the private direction had come from the senior level of the family's future planning, where decisions about royal responsibilities were discussed long before the public ever saw them. But Catherine reportedly made one point unmistakably clear. There was no publicly established evidence that Louis had been formally removed from any royal role. What existed was a confidential direction, a set of recommendations that had quietly gained influence because powerful people believed it was the safest course for the younger prince. George stared at his mother. That distinction should have made him feel better. It did not, because the real shock was not that someone had imagined a different future for Louis. It was that the adults involved had apparently decided the direction first and expected the children to understand it later. Catherine reportedly explained that the plan had never been intended as a punishment. Louis had not been accused of anything. He had not failed a royal duty. He had not created a problem that needed to be corrected. The concern was entirely about what could happen years into the future. The people behind the recommendation feared that Louis could grow into adulthood, defined almost entirely by George. The future king would have a role waiting for him from birth. Louis would not. That difference could become dangerous if nobody handled it carefully. George reportedly listened as Catherine described the pressure that could eventually surround both brothers. Every public appearance could invite comparisons. Every success could be measured against the other. If George became monarch and Louis remained permanently attached to his brother's official life, people could begin asking what Louis was doing for the crown, what influence he had, and whether he deserved more. The opposite could happen too. If Louis wanted independence, some might accuse him of abandoning royal duty. The plan, Catherine explained, was supposed to prevent both outcomes. But George heard something more painful. He heard that the palace had already begun imagining a world where his brother needed protection from the consequences of being his brother. George reportedly asked whether that meant he was the problem. Catherine answered immediately, no, George was not the problem. The system surrounding his future was the problem. That answer struck him because it separated George the brother from George the future king. As a child, he could love Louis without conditions. As monarch, however, his position would carry expectations that could reach into every relationship around him. Catherine reportedly told him that one of the greatest dangers of becoming king was believing that responsibility gave him control over everyone he loved. George did not want control. He wanted his brother beside him. That was precisely why the conversation hurt. He had spent years imagining the future in simple terms. He would eventually become king. Louis would grow older. Charlotte would grow older. They would remain a family. Now he was being told that the crown could complicate even that simple promise. Catherine reportedly reached for the private papers again. The wording was careful. Louis would be encouraged toward an independent identity. He would not be required to follow George into every aspect of royal duty. His education could develop around his own interests. His eventual professional life could be outside the central working monarchy. His public presence could be limited or shaped differently from George's. None of those ideas, taken individually, was extraordinary. Together, however, they represented a philosophy about the next generation of the royal family. George finally understood that the plan was not really about pushing Louis away. It was about preventing Louis from becoming trapped. That was the second layer of the revelation. The secret had looked threatening because it had been hidden. The purpose behind it was more complicated. And yet Catherine still believed the secrecy had gone too far. She reportedly told George that a good intention did not automatically make a secret decision acceptable. Louis deserved the chance to grow into his own future. George deserved to understand how that future might affect his family, and neither brother should discover the arrangement through palace paperwork after the adults had already made up their minds. George lowered his eyes. For the first time, the anger in his face began to change. It was becoming something closer to sadness. He realized that the people involved had probably believed they were protecting him too. If Louis became independent, George would not have to carry the hidden burden of finding a permanent place for his brother inside his reign. That burden could become enormous. A future monarch could feel responsible for providing opportunities, public roles, financial security, and recognition to members of his own family. But if Louis built an identity before adulthood that did not depend on George, the relationship could remain personal. George could be Louis's brother, not his employer. Not his protector by royal obligation, not the person responsible for giving his life meaning. That realization finally broke through. Yet George still had one question: who had allowed the plan to move forward? Catherine reportedly explained that the available material pointed to senior palace planning rather than a single public decree. The authorization had given the recommendations enough weight to circulate among those responsible for preparing the next generation. That was the bombshell. There was no dramatic public order, no announcement, no formal declaration that Louis had been removed from anything. Instead, there had been something quieter and potentially more powerful. A direction had been approved behind the scenes. Once that direction existed, others began preparing around it. George reportedly understood why Catherine had been disturbed. A secret does not need a signature from the monarch to influence a family's future. Sometimes all it needs is enough authority for everyone else to assume the decision has already been made. And that was what made Catherine's discovery so significant. She had not uncovered proof that Louis was being expelled from royal life. She had uncovered evidence of a philosophy being quietly built around his future. A philosophy that could eventually determine how the family treated him. George remained silent. Catherine watched him carefully. She knew the next question before he asked it. If all of this was supposedly designed to protect Louis, then Louis must have known something. George finally looked up. Did Louis know? Catherine paused. That pause frightened him more than any answer could have. Because if Louis already knew, George was not simply the last person to hear about the plan. He might have been the only person inside the immediate family who had not understood how far the conversations had gone. Catherine finally revealed that Louis had noticed changes around him, even if he had not understood their full meaning. The younger prince had sensed that adults were thinking about his future. He had noticed conversations stopping when he entered a room. He had noticed George becoming unusually protective. He had noticed that questions about what he wanted to become were being asked more seriously. But Louis did not know the entire story. Not yet. And that meant the family still had one conversation left. This time, Catherine could not control what would be said. George could not control it either. Because the person at the center of the secret was about to hear what had been planned for him. Louis was about to learn that his future had been discussed long before he had chosen it. And when George finally faced his younger brother, the question would no longer be who authorized the plan. It would be whether Louis wanted the future everyone else had been trying to build for him. If you have stayed this far, do not leave now. Subscribe and stay with the story, because the next part is where the secret stops being a palace decision and becomes a deeply personal moment between two brothers. Louis was finally standing in front of George, and for the first time, there was no palace briefing between them, no advisor explaining what the future was supposed to look like, and no carefully prepared language designed to soften the truth. George had spent days imagining this moment. He had imagined Louis becoming angry. He had imagined him frightened. He had even imagined his younger brother asking why the family had been discussing his future without telling him. But the real Louis was different. He did not look betrayed. He looked confused. That reaction immediately unsettled George, because it forced him to reconsider everything he had been feeling. The secret had seemed enormous from George's perspective. It had carried the weight of succession, palace authority, family loyalty, and the future of the monarchy. For Louis, it was simply a question about growing up. George reportedly struggled to explain it. He told Louis that people had been thinking about his future. They had been discussing ways for him to develop his own interests, his own work, and eventually, his own identity, outside the responsibilities that would surround George. Louis listened. There was no dramatic reaction. No anger, no accusation. Instead, the younger prince reportedly asked the question George had never thought to ask. Why did that mean they could not still be brothers? The question stopped George, because that had been the fear underneath everything. George had not really been afraid of Louis having a different career. He had not been afraid of Louis becoming independent. He had been afraid that independence would eventually become distance. That one sentence exposed the misunderstanding. Louis did not see a separate future as a separation from George. He saw it as a chance to become himself. George reportedly began to understand what Catherine had been trying to explain. The plan had never needed to be a threat. The secrecy had made it feel like one. That distinction mattered. If the palace had simply told the family that Louis might eventually choose a different path, there might never have been a crisis. But because the discussions had allegedly taken place quietly, the information arrived with the emotional weight of a betrayal. George had interpreted secrecy as evidence that something was wrong. Louis did not. He simply wanted to know whether the people around him would still love him if his future looked different. That was the moment Catherine's concerns became clearer. The real danger was not Louis leaving the central royal structure. The real danger was Louis believing that he had to remain there to prove that he belonged. George reportedly admitted that he had been afraid. He feared that becoming king would eventually mean losing the ordinary relationship he had with his brother. He feared that schedules, responsibilities, public appearances, and expectations would slowly replace the simple moments they shared as children. He feared that one day, Louis would become someone he saw only during official events. Louis's response reportedly changed everything. The younger brother did not promise that their lives would remain identical. He did not promise that he would always live nearby or follow George into royal duties. He offered something much simpler. They would remain brothers. George finally understood that he had been trying to protect something that did not need to be protected in the way he imagined. Their relationship did not require identical futures. It required choice. If Louis chose to pursue a life outside the central working monarchy, that choice could actually strengthen their relationship, because he would not be standing beside George out of obligation. He would be there because he wanted to be. That realization transformed the entire meaning of Catherine's discovery. The secret plan no longer looked like a blueprint for separation. It looked like an attempt, however imperfectly handled, to prevent dependence from becoming resentment. And yet one question remained. Why had Catherine been so determined to reveal the truth? Because she understood something the palace planners had overlooked. Children do not experience strategy as strategy. They experience it emotionally. A plan intended to create freedom can feel like rejection if nobody explains it. A decision intended to protect a relationship can damage that relationship if it is hidden for too long. Catherine reportedly wanted George to understand the truth before he created his own explanation. She wanted Louis to understand that independence did not mean abandonment. And she wanted both brothers to enter adulthood without believing that royal hierarchy determined their value to one another. For George, that was perhaps the most difficult lesson. The crown would eventually demand much from him, but it could not be allowed to define every relationship in his life. He could be heir and brother at the same time. He could eventually become king without becoming the person responsible for deciding what his siblings should be. Louis could have his own ambitions without becoming a threat to George. That was the balance Catherine had been trying to protect. And suddenly, the original revelation looked very different. Catherine had not uncovered evidence that Louis had been secretly removed from the family. She had uncovered a direction concerning his future that had been discussed without the brothers fully understanding it. She had discovered that people with influence were already thinking years ahead. She had discovered that a quiet decision could eventually become an expectation, and she had decided that George deserved to know before that happened. That was why he had been left speechless. Not because Louis had been condemned to disappear from royal life, not because his brother had done anything wrong, but because George had suddenly realized how powerful his future position already was. He had not yet worn the crown. He had not yet carried the full responsibilities of monarchy, and yet his destiny was already influencing decisions concerning the person closest to him. That realization could have frightened him. Instead, it gave him a different understanding of what leadership might eventually require. Perhaps becoming king would not mean controlling the people around him. Perhaps it would mean knowing when to step back. Perhaps the strongest way to protect Louis was not to keep him close at all costs. Perhaps it was to allow him to become independent enough that their relationship could remain free. Catherine reportedly saw the change in George. The anger had softened. The fear had not disappeared completely, but it had changed shape. George was no longer asking how he could stop Louis from having a different future. He was asking how the brothers could make sure that different futures did not destroy what they already had. That was a much healthier question, and it was one the palace could not answer for them. Only the brothers could. The wider significance of the story also became impossible to ignore. Royal succession creates an unavoidable imbalance. One child is born closer to the throne. Another grows up knowing that the crown will probably never be theirs. That difference can shape everything from education to public expectations, but it does not have to determine affection. A future monarch can have siblings who are not supporting characters in his story. They can have ambitions that do not involve the crown. They can disagree. They can build separate careers. They can live different lives and still remain a family. That may have been the real lesson hidden inside Catherine's revelation. The monarchy can organize duties. It can organize ceremonies. It can organize succession, but it cannot successfully organize love. George reportedly understood that by the end of the conversation. Louis did not need to remain permanently beside him to prove his loyalty. George did not need to control Louis's future to prove that he loved him. And Catherine did not need to choose between protecting one son and preparing the other. The future could be different, without the family becoming divided. The secret itself, however, remained a warning. When decisions involving children are made quietly, even good intentions can create fear. The people behind the plan may have believed they were preventing a future problem, but Catherine's reaction showed why transparency mattered. If Louis's future was going to be different, he deserved to understand why. If George's future could affect his brother, George deserved to understand that too. And if the monarchy was going to shape both lives, then the family needed to remain at the center of the decision. That was where the story finally returned, to the moment that had started everything. George sitting in silence, Catherine revealing what she had discovered, Louis's future suddenly becoming the most important subject in the room. The silence had not meant that George rejected his brother. It meant he was processing something far larger. He was realizing that the future he had always imagined as his own was already connected to another person's freedom. And perhaps that was the truth Catherine wanted him to understand. George could inherit the crown. Louis could inherit nothing from that crown. Yet neither position made one brother more valuable than the other. One would carry a different responsibility. The other would carry a different freedom. And if both were allowed to choose their paths without resentment, the brothers might avoid the very conflict the secret plan had been created to prevent. For Catherine, that was the outcome that mattered. Not whether Louis became more visible, not whether he eventually pursued a public role, not whether palace officials got their preferred arrangement. What mattered was that neither son grew up believing his place in the family depended on the monarchy. That was the truth behind the revelation, and that was why George had been left speechless. He had entered the conversation thinking he was about to hear a decision about Louis. He left understanding something about himself. The crown would one day define his public life. It did not have to define his private heart. If this story made you stop and think about how easily a family decision can become a lifetime burden, then do not simply move on and let the issue disappear. Subscribe. Share this story with someone who believes family should never be kept in the dark. And stay connected, because the question raised by Catherine's discovery is bigger than Louis alone. When the palace plans a child's future, before that child can choose it, who should have the final say?